They called him the Scourge of God. In 1978, he stood further in the form of the city of the world. But who was Attila, really? Was he a brutal barbarian or a brilliant strategist who reshaped Europe? And how did the most terrifying warlord of his age die on his wedding night? Stay with me, because tonight we're uncovering the untold truth about Attila the Hun. And I promise, this isn't the story you learned in school. For centuries, the name Attila has echoed like a dark drumbeat across the memory of Europe. To the Romans, he was not merely a man, he was calamity given flesh, a living disaster sent by the heavens to punish the sins of the world. They called him the Scourge of God. His reputation was so terrifying that entire cities surrendered at the rumor of his approach. Mothers whispered his name as a threat to keep children silent. Kings prayed for protection against him. But behind the myth, behind the stories painted by frightened chroniclers, there was a human being, one far more complex than the caricature of a bloodthirsty barbarian. To his people, the Huns, Attila was not a monster but a savior, a leader who carried the weight of their destiny. They saw in him not destruction, but survival. And perhaps that is why his legend begins not with conquest, but with a sign from the gods. One tale, preserved by the historian Jordanes, tells of a humble shepherd who stumbled upon something strange in the fields. His cow had been wounded, its leg cut open by something sharp protruding from the earth. The shepherd cleared the soil away and uncovered a blade, ancient, gleaming, unlike any weapon he had ever seen. Unsure of its meaning, he brought it to his leader. When Attila held that blade, his eyes are said to have burned with recognition. He declared it no ordinary weapon. This was the sword of Mars, the war god's own steel, placed in his hands by fate itself. To the Huns, the discovery was no accident. It was divine confirmation that Attila had been chosen. With this sword, he would rule. With this sword, he would conquer. And so, the legend of Attila was born. The Romans, hearing this story, whispered of dark omens. They feared that a weapon forged by the gods themselves had been delivered into the hands of their enemy. But the Huns celebrated it as a sacred prophecy. For then, Attila was no longer just a warlord. He was destiny incarnate. His followers believed that as long as the sword of Mars was in his grasp, no empire on earth could resist him. And Attila believed it too. From that moment, his ambitions stretched far beyond the steppes. He no longer saw himself as a mere leader of horsemen. He was now an instrument of divine will, born to reshape the world with fire and steel. Yet this moment also reveals something essential about Attila. His genius was not only in battle, but in symbolism. Whether or not the sword truly belonged to Mars, Attila understood the power of belief. He wielded not just weapons, but myths. Where the Romans ruled through marble monuments and law, Attila ruled through fear and prophecy. The sword of Mars was more than metal. It was a story, a legend that gave his people unshakable faith in him. Imagine the effect. Warriors who believed they fought under the blessing of the gods themselves. Men who rode into battle certain that destiny was on their side. This was Attila's true strength. His armies were not the largest the world had seen. His resources were not endless, but his vision and the conviction he inspired made them unstoppable. Still, there is irony here. For all his reputation, Attila did not present himself as a man drunk on wealth or luxury. Unlike Roman emperors, who cloaked themselves in purple and dined on silver, Attila would later be described by witnesses as plain, even austere. He drank from wooden cups, ate simply, and wore unadorned clothes. And yet, this man of humble habits held the sword of a god. A paradox wrapped in legend, marching ever closer to Rome's gates. The world was beginning to tremble, and Rome, once invincible, now fractured and desperate, looked eastward in fear. Attila had not yet burned their cities, but already he haunted their nightmares. His story was only beginning, and every empire around him could sense it. The Sword of Mars, whether real or imagined, was the first sign that Attila's life would not follow the path of ordinary men. It marked him as chosen, cursed, or perhaps both. And as we follow his journey, we will see how a man with such a destiny could rise to terrify the greatest empire on earth, and how, in the end, destiny itself would betray him on the night of his greatest joy. But for now, picture Attila not as the monster of legend, but as the actors gave life to speak with friends. In his hands lay the promise of conquest, the fear of nations, and the beginning of a story that with the first fate of the road came from the deep. The story of Attila does not begin with the man himself, but with the people who would carry him into legend, the Huns. To the Romans of the 4th and 5th centuries, they appeared as if conjured from the edge of the world. Savage horsemen, emerging suddenly from the endless steppes of Central Asia, they struck terror with their arrival. No chronicler could say for certain where they had come from. Some claimed they were the descendants of wild Scythian tribes. Others whispered that they were monsters born of the union between witches and wandering spirits. Whatever their origin, they carried with them an aura of mystery that the civilized world could neither comprehend nor resist. The Huns were unlike any enemy the Romans had ever faced. They did not march in ordered legions, nor did they rely on fortified towns. Instead, they moved with the wind, tribes bound by kinship, carried on small, swift horses that seemed to live as much in the saddle as on the ground. Roman writers describe them as nearly inseparable from their mounts, eating, sleeping, and even negotiating deals without ever dismounting. Their style of warfare was terrifyingly new. They rained arrows from horseback, striking with speed and disappearing into the distance before an enemy line could respond. For an empire used to discipline and structure, these tactics felt less like war and more like being hunted by shadows. Into this world of shifting clans and unending raids, Attila was born around the year 406. His exact birthplace is unknown. Some say on the Hungarian plain, others argue farther east, but what is certain is that his childhood was steeped in harsh realities of steppe life. From the moment a Hun child could walk, he was taught to ride. From the moment he could hold a stick, he was taught to draw a bow. The bow itself was no ordinary weapon. Crafted from wood, horn, and sinew, the Hun composite bow was small enough to use on horseback, yet powerful enough to pierce armor. It was the equalizer that allowed a nomadic people to challenge even the greatest armies in the world. Attila grew up alongside his brother, Bleda. Together, they represented the future of their people. The two boys were not raised in luxury. The Huns valued toughness above all else. A story told by later chroniclers claimed that Hun infants were scarred deliberately, their cheeks cut so they would grow accustomed to pain and never fear blood. While it is uncertain whether Attila himself bore such marks, the legend reflects the values of his society. Strength, endurance, and fearlessness were virtues instilled from the cradle. But Attila's education went beyond the martial. He was part of a new generation of Huns who had contact with the Roman world. As a young man, he may have spent time as a hostage within the empire, an arrangement common in treaties of the time. If so, he would have seen Roman cities, their walls and their wealth, their decadence and their order. For a keen mind like his, this would have been a revelation. He would come to understand not just how the empire fought, but also how it thought. Later, this knowledge would become one of his greatest weapons. The early 5th century was a time of chaos for Rome. The empire was split into east and west, both battered by constant invasions and internal struggles. Goths, Vandals, and countless other tribes pressed at the borders. The Huns exploited this instability. They served sometimes as messengers, sometimes as enemies, switching roles as profit demanded. When Attila came of age, he inherited not just a people hardened by war, but a political situation ripe for exploitation. In 434, following the death of their uncle Rugila, Attila and Bleda assumed joint leadership of the Huns. At first, they ruled together, forging alliances and striking fear into both Eastern and Western Rome. The empire found itself forced to negotiate, paying enormous sums of gold as tribute in exchange for peace. This was not merely extortion, it was strategy. Every bag of gold that crossed the Danube enriched the Huns and drained the empire. Attila was beginning to understand the true balance of power. Rome could be bled not just by swords, but by its own wealth. Yet even at this early stage, Attila's presence stood out. Accounts describe him as a man of contradictions. Unlike the decadent kings of Rome, he lived simply, eating from wooden dishes and dressing plainly, despite the riches at his command. He demanded loyalty, but was not reckless with his warriors' lives. He could be merciless in conquest, yet calculating in diplomacy. To his enemies, he was a scourge. To his people, he was a leader chosen by destiny. There is a fascinating detail in Priscus's account, a Roman historian who actually met Attila. He described the Hun leader's court, noting how Attila himself refrained from the jeweled goblets and golden platters of his nobles. Instead, he chose modest wooden utensils, setting himself apart not through display, but through restraint. This was a man who did not need to flaunt power. He embodied it. His aura was enough to silence a room. But behind this seemingly humble exterior lay an iron will. The alliance with his brother Bleda was always uneasy. Shared power is fragile, and in time it would collapse. Whispers spread that Attila was destined to rule alone, that he had the cunning and ruthlessness his brother lacked. Indeed, only a few years later, Bleda would vanish from the chronicles, murdered, many say, by Attila's own hand. The details remain uncertain, but one thing is clear. By the late 440s, Attila stood as the sole ruler of the Huns. World would soon learn what that truly meant. For now, the boy born on the steppes, the rider who grew up with the bow and the horse, had become a warlord, but he was not yet the scourge of God. That title, whispered by terrified Romans, was still to come. And, as Attila sharpened his ambitions, the empire trembled, not yet realizing that its greatest test was approaching. When Attila came of age, the Huns were already a force that Europe feared, but it was under the joint rule of Attila and his elder brother Bleda that their name became synonymous with terror. Well, the brothers inherited the leadership of the Huns around the year 434, after the death of their uncle Rugila, who had ruled before them. At first glance, it seemed like a perfect partnership. Attila, younger but sharper, ambitious and cunning, balanced by Bleda, older, more measured, and inclined toward negotiation. But beneath the surface of this alliance lay the seeds of rivalry, as both men knew that only one could ultimately command the undivided loyalty of the Hun people. The world into which the brothers stepped was already fractured. The Roman Empire was no longer the titan it had once been. Instead, it was split into two halves. The Eastern Roman Empire centered in Constantinople, and the Western Roman Empire, struggling to maintain order in Italy and beyond. Both halves feared the Huns, but both were also willing to pay for peace. The Huns understood this perfectly, and Attila in particular learned to use Roman fear as a weapon more powerful than the sword. In their early years of co-rule, Attila and Bleda turned their attention to the Eastern Empire. In 434, shortly after ascending to power, the brothers negotiated the Treaty of Margus with Emperor Theodosius II. On parchment, it looked like peace. Rome agreed to pay 700 pounds of gold each year to the Huns in exchange for their withdrawal and a promise not to raid imperial lands. But to Attila, the treaty was not a gesture of goodwill. It was a declaration of weakness. He recognized that an empire willing to buy safety once would be willing to do so again and again, as long as the threat of Hun violence remained looming on the horizon. The treaty was not merely a political arrangement. It became a foundation of the Huns' growing power.
In this panton with the deserts and do not to them. In this sense, the Roman Empire was financing the very force that would one day seek to destroy it.
Yet treaties were fragile things, and Attila was not the sort of man to sit idly by while opportunity passed him. Whenever Rome faltered in its payments, whenever the emperor showed signs of hesitation, Attila and Bleda reminded them of the cost of delay. Raiding parties swept across the Danube, striking into Thrace, Moesia, and other vulnerable territories. These raids were not mere theft, they were psychological warfare. Entire villages were burned, their survivors driven before the Hun horsemen as human spoils. To those who watched their city smolder, the message was clear: resistance was hopeless. And so, in the mid-430s, the Huns became both a shadow and a storm. The brothers ruled together, but their methods and temperaments were visibly diverging. Bleda was content to enjoy the wealth pouring in from the Romans, preferring stability and the steady luxuries of power. Attila, however, was restless. He did not see gold as the end, but as the means to something greater. To him, the tribute was proof that Rome was soft, decadent, ripe for deeper plunder. Stories began to circulate among the Huns about Attila's relentlessness. He was not a man to indulge too long in comfort. He slept little, ate sparingly, and refused to be carried away by the luxuries that dazzled other nobles. His warriors noticed, and they respected him for it. Attila embodied the image of a leader who would never ask of his men what he would not endure himself. Like many rulers of his age, who separated themselves with jewels, silks, and lavish banquets, Attila remained close to the campfires of his soldiers. The Roman envoys who met him during these early years were often shocked. They had expected barbaric extravagance, but instead they found a man who dressed simply, wore plain garments, and sat in wooden chairs, even when a golden throne had been offered. This simplicity was not a lack of taste, it was a deliberate choice. Attila was crafting his image, showing his people that he was no ordinary chief, but a leader destined to command through discipline and strength rather than indulgence. Meanwhile, the Huns pressed further into Europe. Their raids grew bolder and their reputation darker. It was said that wherever Attila's horse passed, grass would never grow again. A legend born not of literal truth, but of the scorched earth his armies left behind. Cities emptied at the mere rumor of their approach, and bishops prayed desperately in churches for deliverance. For the first time, Rome realized that it was dealing with not just another wandering tribe, but with a power capable of shaking its very foundations. Still, the uneasy partnership between the brothers held for a time. Together, they forced the Eastern Empire to sign yet another treaty in 443, this time demanding an even higher tribute, 2,100 pounds of gold annually. Rome agreed, unable to fight back effectively. For Attila, this was further proof that fear could be converted into endless wealth. But for Bleda, it was enough. He sought to enjoy the spoils, to let the rivers of gold sustain their kingdom. Attila, however, was not satisfied. He was already dreaming of a Hun empire greater than anything his ancestors had imagined. He looked westward, toward the weakened Western Roman Empire, and saw fertile lands, vulnerable cities, and rulers too weak to stop him. He looked inward, too, at his brother and wondered how long two rulers could truly share one throne. By the mid-440s, Attila was no longer just the ruler of a nomadic horde. He had become the terror of Europe itself. The death of his brother Bleda had left him as the undisputed master of the Huns, and with this sole authority, he unleashed his ambitions. The death could not be such for something but tended to step up in hospitals' lives. Various Germanic tribes, the collapse of imperial authority, the Visigoths, Burgundians, Franks, and others. The Western Roman Empire, under the generalship of Flavius Aetius, held only a precarious grip on its provinces. Into this volatile landscape came Attila, the scourge of God, commanding perhaps the most fearsome host Europe had ever seen. In 451 AD, Attila launched his invasion of Gaul. The Roman historian Jordanes describes how the ground trembled under the advance of his army, which may have numbered more than 200,000 men, a coalition of Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, and other subjected peoples. It was not simply a raid for plunder, it was a march of domination. Attila aimed to bend Gaul to his will, to turn it into yet another province under his shadow. Yet the march was not unopposed. Aetius, one of Rome's last great generals, recognized the gravity of the threat. He had spent much of his career dealing with barbarian tribes, often playing them against one whether he would be active and friends, and also what would be active and right to set his crimes. Together, Romans and Goths prepared to confront Attila in open battle, a desperate gamble, for neither side could claim overwhelming superiority. The confrontation came at the Catalonian plains, near modern-day Chalon. It was one of the last great battles of antiquity, fought on a scale that seemed almost mythic to later generations. Chroniclers tell of rivers running red with blood, of corpses covering the fields so thickly that the earth could no longer be seen. Attila, riding at the center of his host, directed his forces with ruthless precision. His cavalry struck like a thunderbolt, driving into the heart of the Roman Gothic lines. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain. Theodoric himself was slain in the melee, trampled beneath his horse as the tide of battle surged around him. But the alliance held firm, and Aetius, seizing the moment, counterattacked with disciplined Roman troops and Visigothic fury combined. Ziphoros is compelled to the dead. See at the Gothic table. By nightfall, the Huns had been driven back. Attila, for the first time in his career, had been checked. He retreated to his fortified camp, where he prepared for either a renewed assault or a desperate defense. Some accounts claim he even built a great funeral pyre from saddles, intending to immolate himself should his enemies breach his lines. Whether true or exaggerated, it speaks to the intensity of that night, when the fate of Europe hung by a thread. The next morning, however, Aetius did not press the attack. He allowed Attila to withdraw with his army intact. Why? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some suggest that Aetius feared the destruction of the Huns would leave the Visigoths too powerful, turning Gaul into their domain. Others believe he sought to preserve Attila as a counterweight in the delicate balance of barbarian politics. Whatever his reasoning, the result was the same. Attila lived to fight another day. The Catalonian defeat was not the end of his ambitions. It was merely a pause. The battle did not break the Huns, and their king remained unbowed. If Gaul could not be seized in one swift strike, there was still Italy, still Rome itself, still the dream of empire carved by fire and steel. Thus, though beaten back, Attila's shadow continued to stretch across Europe. The man who had been called the Scourge of God had tasted resistance, but not defeat. The world would soon discover that even in retreat, Attila was far from finished. By the middle of the 440s, Attila had become more than a warlord. He was the nightmare of an empire. The Romans, who once had called Hannibal their greatest foe, began whispering a new name with dread: Attila, the Scourge of God. This title was not his invention. It was given by terrified contemporaries who saw his invasions as divine punishment for the sins of Rome. And Attila, far from denying it, seemed to embrace it. His reputation rested not only on his brutal raids, but on the speed with which he struck. Unlike the lumbering Roman legions, the Hunnic cavalry could cover enormous distances in days, appearing where no enemy expected them. Villages burned overnight, cities were emptied, and refugees clogged the Roman roads, spreading stories of horror. The psychological effect of his campaigns often outweighed the actual destruction. People fled before his armies even arrived, abandoning entire provinces in panic. The Eastern Roman Empire bore the brunt of his early fury. Attila forced them into a humiliating treaty, demanding thousands of pounds of gold each year as tribute. Yet the Romans' mistake was assuming this would buy peace. To Attila, tribute was not an end, but a beginning, a sign of weakness that encouraged more demands. When payments faltered, he unleashed his warriors again, tearing through the Balkans. But Attila's ambitions were never confined to the east. His eyes turned toward the Western Roman Empire, where political chaos offered him opportunities. The Emperor Valentinian III was weak, and real power lay in the hands of generals and court officials. Even more intriguing was Valentinian's sister, Honoria. In a scandal that rocked the imperial household, she secretly sent a plea for help, and, most shockingly, her ring, to Attila, begging him to rescue her from an unwanted marriage. Attila seized upon this as if fate itself had handed him a justification. Declaring that Honoria had offered herself as his bride, he demanded half of the Western Empire as her dowry. To the Romans, this was absurd, but to Attila, it was a masterstroke. He could now cloak his invasion not as naked conquest, but as a legitimate marital claim, sanctioned by Roman blood. His march into Gaul in 451 was one of the most traumatic invasions in antiquity. Hordes of warriors followed him, Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, and other subject peoples, forming an unstoppable tide. Cities fell in rapid succession. The great city of Metz was burned, and Paris trembled in fear. Legend tells that the citizens of Paris prayed all night, and a young woman, later revered as Saint Genevieve, urged them not to flee. Miraculously, Attila bypassed the city, sparing it. To this day, Parisians honor her as the savior of their city. The climax came on the Catalonian plains, near modern-day Chalon. There, a hastily assembled coalition, led by the Roman general Aetius and his Visigothic allies, confronted Attila's horde. The battle was apocalyptic in scale. Chroniclers claimed tens of thousands died, though the numbers are impossible to know. What is certain is that it was one of the bloodiest clashes of the late ancient world. Attila, for the first time, was checked. He retreated, his aura of invincibility bruised but not destroyed. Yet even in retreat, Attila remained a terror. He regrouped, invaded Italy the following year, and sacked city after city. Rome itself seemed doomed, until an extraordinary meeting took place. Pope Leo I rode out to meet the King of the Huns. What passed between them is shrouded in mystery. Some sources say Leo persuaded Attila through diplomacy. Others suggest a miraculous vision frightened the Hun into withdrawal. Whatever the truth, Attila turned back, sparing the eternal city from his wrath. Still, the West could not rest easy. Everyone knew Attila would return. The question was not if, but when, and in what fury. His name was now etched into the Roman psyche as an almost supernatural force, a punishment sent from the heavens. Rome had faced many enemies before, but none like Attila the Hun. In the year 451, Attila's ambition reached its most dramatic stage. After years of extracting wealth from the Eastern Roman Empire, he now turned his gaze westward. His target, the Western Roman Empire, weakened by civil wars, internal corruption, and a shrinking economy. But Attila was not simply seeking gold this time. He wanted dominion, recognition, and perhaps even to place himself at the center of Roman power. The official excuse for his campaign was one steeped in scandal. Honoria, the ambitious sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, had written a desperate letter to Attila, begging for rescue from an unwanted political marriage. Along with her plea, she sent her ring, a token of supposed betrothal. And to Attila, this was no small gesture. He declared that he had been offered the hand of a Roman princess and demanded half the Western Empire as dowry. When his claim was rejected with outrage, Attila used it as a pretext for war. In the spring of 451, a vast army assembled under his command. The numbers given by ancient sources are wildly exaggerated. Some claim 500,000 men, but modern historians estimate perhaps 60,000 to 100,000 warriors. His host was not solely Hun. It included subject peoples, Goths, Gepids, Alans, and others, all united under his banner by a mixture of fear and promise of plunder. This immense army began its march across Gaul, modern-day France, leaving devastation in its wake. But Rome was not without allies. General Flavius Aetius, one of the most capable commanders of the age, understood that Rome could not face Attila alone. Aetius forged alliances with the Visigoths under King Theodoric I, as well as Burgundians, Franks, and other tribes. It was a rare and fragile coalition, united only by fear of Attila's destruction. The decisive clash came at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, near modern-day Chalons. It was one of the last great battles of the Western Roman Empire, remembered as a titanic struggle between civilizations. On one side stood Attila, the feared horse lord of the steppes. On the other, Aetius and Theodoric, rallying the last embers of Roman prestige and Gothic might. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and legendary. Accounts describe Attila's horsemen thundering across the fields, their arrows darkening the sky, while the Visigothic infantry stood firm, driving them back with shields and spears. The battle raged until dusk, with tens of thousands dead. At one critical moment, Theodoric, the Visigothic king, was slain, spurring his people into a furious counterattack that shattered Attila's advance. Realizing the tide was turning, Attila retreated to his fortified camp, surrounding himself with wagons. Ancient writers claim that he prepared a massive funeral pyre, intending to burn himself alive rather than be captured. Yet, fortune shifted again. Aetius, wary of destroying Attila completely, fearing that Rome would become too dependent on the Visigoths, allowed the Huns to withdraw rather than finish them off. Although Attila had not been defeated outright, the battle marked his first major setback. The myth of his invincibility cracked, yet, even in retreat, his legend grew. The West trembled at the thought that he might return, and in truth, he would. The failed conquest of Gaul was not the end of Attila's story, but a turning point. His ambitions, though wounded, remained undiminished. And soon, he would set his eyes upon an even greater prize, the eternal city itself, Rome. When Attila turned his armies back from the gates of Rome in 452 AD, the Western world could hardly believe what had happened. A man who had reduced cities to ash and made emperors tremble had suddenly stopped at the threshold of the eternal city. Some whispered it was fear of famine and disease. Others claimed it was the power of Pope Leo's words, and many more believed that the gods themselves had stayed his hand. Whatever the reason, Attila returned to his stronghold beyond the Danube, alive, undefeated, and still feared by all. The world expected that his retreat was only temporary. After all, the scourge of God had never been satisfied for long. His envoys continued to demand tribute from both the eastern and western courts, and he began planning yet another invasion of Italy. To the Romans, the pause was a relief, but also a source of dread. They knew that Attila's appetite for conquest was insatiable. But then, history took an unexpected turn. In 453 AD, just months after sparing Rome, Attila shocked even his closest allies. He announced he was to marry again. This time, the bride was a young Gothic princess named Ildiko. For a man who already had multiple wives, this was not unusual. The Huns practiced polygamy, and marriage was as much about politics as it was about family. But the circumstances of this wedding carried an air of finality, as if Attila was marking the beginning of a new phase of his reign. The wedding was celebrated with grand feasting. The Hun camps, usually filled with the sounds of clashing steel and galloping horses, now echoed with music, laughter, and the clinking of goblets. Warriors who had seen the carnage of countless battles now drank to their king's health and future. Attila, towering above them, appeared in high spirits. His power was at its height. He had humbled 2 Roman empires, made himself the master of countless tribes, and his enemies still paid him gold simply to keep the peace. He seemed invincible. And yet, on that very night, destiny dealt its final blow. The morning after the wedding feast, Attila's guards entered his tent and found a sight that stunned them. The great conqueror lay motionless on his bed, his face pale, his body lifeless. At his side sat Ildiko, the young bride, her expression unreadable. Some accounts say she wept uncontrollably. Others claim she remained silent, unable or unwilling to explain what had happened. The official report given by his retainers was that Attila had died of a massive nosebleed, suffocating in his own blood as he slept. To the Huns, who believed that such a fate was unworthy of a warrior, this explanation was as humiliating as it was tragic. How could a man who had survived countless battles fall victim to something so mundane? Almost immediately, rumors spread. Some whispered that Ildiko had murdered him, slipping a dagger into his chest or poisoning his wine at the feast. Others suggested that the gods themselves had struck him down, tired of the terror he had unleashed upon the world. Roman writers, eager to frame his death as divine justice, painted the image of the scourge of God, destroyed not by armies, but by fate itself, on the night of his wedding, no less. Whatever the truth, Attila's death shook the foundations of his empire. The Huns, who had been held together by his charisma and authority, were suddenly without their unifying figure. Though his sons tried to claim his legacy, they lacked his vision and power. Within a few short years, the vast Hun confederation fractured, tribes had broke away, and enemies once cowed by his might rose in rebellion. Attila was given a burial befitting a legend. According to tradition, his body was encased in 3 coffins, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron. His grave was said to have been hidden by diverting a river, and the slaves who carried out the burial were executed to ensure its secrecy. To this day, the resting place of Attila the Hun remains one of history's enduring mysteries. His sudden death in the bloom of victory gave rise to one of the most dramatic legends of late antiquity, that no man, no city, no empire could bring down Attila, but destiny itself had chosen the time and place of his fall. He had entered his bridal chamber as the most feared man in the world and left it a corpse. For the Romans, this was divine providence. For the Huns, it was catastrophe. And for us, centuries later, it remains one of the strangest and most haunting endings to the life of any conqueror. In the year 452, Attila set his gaze upon Italy itself. Gaul had been a bitter disappointment. He had been checked at the Catalonian plains, forced to retreat from a battlefield he had hoped would cement his invincibility. But Italy promised something different. It was the very heart of the Western Roman Empire, the land of ancient glory and immeasurable wealth. If Gaul had resisted him, perhaps Rome itself could be brought to its knees. Attila crossed the Alps with an army still vast, though diminished from years of constant campaigning. Reports tell of cities that fell quickly as his horde swept southward: Aquileia, Verona, Vicenza, Padua, Milan. Aquileia, in particular, was utterly destroyed. Chroniclers claimed that Attila razed the once proud city so completely that it never recovered, its surviving inhabitants fleeing to the lagoons, where they would eventually establish Venice. Thus, even in destruction, Attila inadvertently helped shape the birth of one of Europe's greatest cities. The march into Italy, however, was not without hardship. The Huns had ridden hard for years, and plague and famine shadowed them. And pain and being all have done. Northern Italy was fertile, but after so many conquests, supplies grew scarce. Worse still, sickness spread through ranks of his men, weakening their once unstoppable momentum. Yet Attila pressed on, determined to strike fear directly into the heart of Rome. And then, in one of the most famous encounters in all of late antiquity, Attila met a man who would stop him without lifting a sword: Pope Leo I. The scene has become legendary. Somewhere near the banks of the river Mincio, north of Mantua, the greatest warlord of his age and the most powerful spiritual leader of Christendom came face to face. We do not know the exact words exchanged, for history has blurred the details, but the effect was undeniable. Attila, who had crushed empires and terrified nations, agreed to turn back. Why did he do it? That question has puzzled historians for centuries. Some suggest Leo persuaded him with promises of tribute and safe passage. Others argue that Attila, already weakened by famine and disease, saw little profit in continuing south when his army might collapse before reaching Rome's gates. Still, medieval chroniclers embellished the story with divine intervention. According to legend, as Leo spoke, Attila saw visions of Saints Peter and Paul standing behind the Pope, swords drawn, threatening the Hun leader with heavenly wrath should he harm Rome. Whether through fear of disease, politics, or divine revelation, Attila turned back. Rome was spared, not by the might of its legions, but by the authority of its faith. This moment cemented Pope Leo's reputation as a protector of the city, while adding an almost mystical aura to Attila himself. Here was a man who bowed to no emperor, but who yielded, at least in part, to the voice of the Church. The retreat from Italy marked the beginning of the end for Attila. His aura of invincibility, though not entirely shattered, was beginning to crack. He had been stopped in Gaul by Aetius, and now in Italy he had been halted not by arms, but by persuasion. For a man who had built his legend on domination, these retreats hinted at a mortal frailty that had long been hidden beneath the thunder of hooves and the blaze of burning cities. Still, Attila returned to his people not as a broken leader, but as one who continued to command respect and fear. Even in retreat, he was dangerous, unpredictable, and very much alive in the imagination of both Romans and barbarians alike. His men remained loyal, his enemies still trembled at his name, and Europe had not yet seen the final chapter of his reign. But the shadow of death was already drawing closer. Within a few short years, the man who had reshaped the map of Europe, terrified empires, and even made Rome itself tremble, would meet his sudden and shocking end, and his death, as strange and mysterious as his life, would only add to the enigma of the Scourge of God. The story of Attila, for all its ferocity and glory, ends not on the battlefield, but in a far more unexpected and mysterious setting. After years of terrorizing both the Eastern and Western Roman empires, the great conqueror met his end, not by the sword of an enemy, nor the betrayal of an ally, but on the night of his own wedding. In the year 453, Attila took yet another wife, one among many, but this particular union would be his last. Her name was Ildiko, a young woman of Germanic origin. The Huns celebrated with feasting, music, and an overwhelming sense of triumph. Their king, who had shaken the very foundations of Rome, was at the height of his power. Yet, as dawn broke, Attila was found dead in his chambers. The accounts of his death are shrouded in contradiction. The historian Priscus, who had once visited Attila's court, wrote that the king had suffered a nosebleed in the might, choking to death on his own blood. It was a strangely anticlimactic end for a man who had made the greatest empires of the age tremble. Others, however, whispered of darker possibilities. Some claimed that Ildiko herself had murdered him, either out of personal revenge or as part of a secret Roman plot. Others suggested poison, or even the wrath of the gods striking him down for his countless atrocities. Regardless of the cause, the sudden death of Attila left his empire in chaos. His warriors, so long united by his will and charisma, now faced the question of succession. The Huns had no tradition of orderly inheritance, and Attila's many sons each believed they were entitled to rule. The vast confederation of tribes he had band together began to fracture almost immediately. The funeral of Attila was as legendary as his life. According to Jordanes, a Gothic historian, his people gave him a burial unlike any other. The secrets became of historians and babies, and both converted. To this day, the final resting place of Attila the Hun remains unknown, a mystery lost to the ages. But the empire he built did not long survive him. Almost immediately, his sons began to quarrel over leadership. The most significant of these disputes came to a head at the Battle of Nedao in 454. Here, a coalition of Germanic tribes that had once been subjects of the Huns rose up in rebellion. Without Attila's iron grip to hold them together, the Hunnic forces were decisively defeated. The once invincible cavalry that had thundered across Europe was broken. In the years that followed, the Huns faded from the stage of history as swiftly as they had appeared. Some remnants scattered eastward, absorbed into other nomadic peoples. Others remained in the lands of the Carpathian Basin, gradually merging with the populations around them. The dream of a Hunnic empire stretching across Europe died with Attila. And yet, his legacy lived on. To the Romans, Attila remained the flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, believed to have been sent as divine punishment for their sins. To the Germanic peoples, his memory entered legend, often as a figure of awe or fear in epic tales and sagas. Centuries later, medieval chroniclers and even Renaissance writers still invoked his name as a symbol of unstoppable destruction. Modern historians debate the extent of his achievements. Was he truly a brilliant strategist, or did he simply exploit the weaknesses of collapsing Rome? Was his empire a genuine state, or merely a loose collection of tribes bound together by fear and plunder? Whatever the case, his impact was undeniable. Attila's campaigns drained the resources of the Roman Empire, accelerated its decline, and reshaped the power dynamics of Europe. And then there is the question of his death. The image of the mighty warlord cut down not in battle, but on his wedding night, is too striking to ignore. It has fueled centuries of speculation and myth-making. Some see it as poetic justice, that a man who dealt so much death should meet an almost pitiful end. Others view it as a symbol of the fleeting nature of power, a reminder that even the greatest conquerors are subject to fate. The fall of Attila and the collapse of his empire reveal a truth that echoes through history. Empires built on fear and violence can burn bright and fierce, but rarely endure. Yet, the shadow of the scourge of God still lingers. His name remains synonymous with terror, his story a cautionary tale of ambition, destruction, and the inevitable downfall that follows unchecked power. The death of Aetius's old patron, the Emperor Valentinian III, had thrown the Western Roman Empire into even greater turmoil than before. Italy's provinces were in open decay, Spain was fractured by Visigoths and Suebi, and North Africa remained in the hands of the Vandals, who cut off Rome's grain supply. Amidst this chaos, the name of Attila grew heavier in the hearts of the Romans. He was no longer simply the scourge of God of the East. By the mid-40s and early 450s, he had become the single most threatening figure looming over the West, a man who could decide the fate of entire kingdoms with one campaign. The story takes a darker turn with the infamous tale of Honoria, the ambitious sister of Valentinian III. According to some accounts, she despised the role forced upon her by court politics, resentful that her brother had promised her hand to a Roman senator to secure alliances. In a desperate bid for power and freedom, Honoria secretly sent Attila a ring, along with an appeal for help. Attila seized upon the opportunity with terrifying cunning. To him, this was no mere plea. It was a marriage proposal, a justification to stake a claim to half of the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. When Valentinian discovered the plot, Honoria's life was spared only by political necessity, but Attila had no intention of abandoning his claim. He declared that the Emperor of Rome had insulted him, that his bride had been withheld from him, and that only war could resolve the matter. In 451, Attila led his armies westward, through the heart of Gaul. Chroniclers speak of his horde sweeping across the land like a storm. Cities burned, fields were trampled, and refugees fled toward fortified strongholds. His coalition of Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, and countless subjected tribes created a force so vast that the ground itself seemed to shake beneath their horses. The archers had been greatly invented. The Visigothic king Theodoric I, though no friend to Rome, understood the danger of Attila's expansion. For if Gaul fell, the Goths themselves would soon be enslaved under the Hunnic lash. And so, for the first time in generations, Rome and the Visigoths stood together. Under the command of Flavius Aetius, the last great Roman general, the Western world gathered what strength it had left to resist the scourge of God. Attila's approach was both swift and merciless. He marched directly toward Orléans, intending to capture the city before the Allied forces could unite. The terrified citizens sent pleas to the heavens and to the Romans alike, their voices filled with dread. It seemed certain that the walls would fall, that Attila's banners would rise above the city before relief could come. But fate twisted at the last possible moment. As Attila prepared his final assault, Aetius and Theodoric arrived with their combined armies. Caught off guard, Attila withdrew to the Catalonian plains, where one of the most decisive and brutal battles of late antiquity would soon be fought. Chroniclers later claimed that more than 100,000 men perished in the clash that followed, a number perhaps exaggerated, yet still symbolic of the scale and savagery of the fight. Theodoric was slain in battle, crushed beneath his horse, but the Visigoths fought on with ferocious resolve. Attila, though unbroken, suffered heavy losses. For the first time in his career, the scourge of God was forced into retreat. And yet, even in retreat, Attila's presence remained a shadow across Europe. He fell back into the heart of his empire, regrouping his armies, his pride wounded, but his ambitions intact. For though Gaul had been saved, for the moment, the Roman world knew the truth. Attila had not been defeated forever. He would return, and when he did, the storm would be worse than before. The legend of Attila only deepened after the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Some Romans claimed that he retreated not out of weakness, but out of divine providence, that God himself had intervened to spare Gaul from destruction. Others whispered that Attila had seen omens in the sky, signs that his destiny lay elsewhere, perhaps in Italy itself. Whatever the truth, one fact was clear. Rome had been granted a reprieve, but not a salvation. The year was 451 CE, and Europe trembled. For over a decade, Attila had battered the frontiers of the Eastern Roman Empire, raining Constantinople of gold and forcing emperors to bow before his might. But now, his gaze had shifted westward. Gaul, the rich provinces of modern France and Belgium, lay open before him. If Rome's heartland was ever to be threatened directly, this was the moment. But fate had arranged a collision unlike any other. Attila the Hun, master of the steppe, would meet Rome's last great general, Flavius Aetius, on a battlefield that would echo through history as one of the bloodiest confrontations of the ancient world, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Attila's march into Gaul was not without purpose. He had been invited, or at least given justification, by a remarkable scandal involving Rome's own royal household. Princess Honoria, sister to the Western Emperor Valentinian III, had sent Attila a desperate plea for help. Trapped in political intrigue and threatened with being forced into a loveless marriage, she secretly sent her ring to the Hun, asking for his protection. Attila took it as a proposal of marriage. His price, half of the Western Roman Empire as dowry. Rome, of course, refused such absurd terms. But for Attila, it was all the excuse he needed. He declared himself Honoria's rightful betrothed and began a devastating march across Gaul, claiming he was nearly seizing what was owed. Villages were razed, cities plundered, and entire populations driven into terror. His army, perhaps numbering more than 100,000, including Ostogothic, Gepid, and other barbarian allies, was a rolling storm. Rome was desperate, but not entirely defenseless. The man who rose to meet Attila was Flavius Aetius, a seasoned general often called the last of the Romans. Ironically, Aetius had once lived among the Huns in his youth, serving as a hostage at their court. He knew their tactics, their psychology, and perhaps even understood Attila better than any Roman alive. This strange bond would shape what came next. Aetius understood that Rome alone could not withstand the Huns. The Western Empire was fractured, its armies weakened, its authority barely holding. So he did what few Roman leaders had managed in generations. He built alliances. The Visigoths under King Theodoric I, the Franks, the Burgundians, and other Germanic tribes, all former enemies of Rome, were persuaded to unite against the common threat of Attila. It was an uneasy coalition, but it was Rome's last hope. The battlefield was chosen at the Catalonian Plains, near modern-day Châlons-des-Champagne. Both sides understood the stakes, the survival of the Roman West and the halt of Attila's advance. As the armies assembled, the sight must have been staggering. Tens of thousands of horsemen from the endless steppes of Central Asia, facing a patchwork army of Romans and Germanic tribes, banners snapping in the wind, the air heavy with the promise of blood. Attila positioned himself carefully, placing his Hunnic cavalry at the center, with his Gothic and other allies on the flanks. Aetius countered by securing the high ground, a critical tactical advantage. King Theodoric and his Visigoths anchored one side of the line. while Aetius commanded the Roman corps. When the battle began, it was chaos unleashed. The Huns charged with their terrifying speed, arrows blotting out the sky, hooves thundering across the plain. The Roman and Visigoth infantry held firm, while Theodoric's forces fought ferociously on the flank. The clash was so violent that later chroniclers would claim the ground itself ran red with blood, and that the souls of the dead could be heard crying out at night from the battlefield. At the height of the battle, tragedy struck the Visigoths. King Theodoric was killed, thrown from his horse, and trampled in the melee. His death nearly shattered the Allied line. But his son, Thorismund, seized command and rallied his warriors, turning grief into fury. With renewed rage, the Visigoths hurled themselves at the Huns, pushing them back. Attila himself, it is said, fought from the center, directing his cavalry and seeking to break the Roman line. Yet as the day wore on, the advantage tilted toward Aetius and his allies. By nightfall, the Huns were forced to retreat to their camp, a fortified wagon circle. Attila prepared for the possibility of suicide, intending to throw himself into a funeral pyre rather than face capture. But Aetius, cautious and calculating, did not press the attack. Why did Aetius allow Attila to escape? Historians debate this endlessly. Some argue he feared that destroying Attila completely would leave the Visigoths too powerful, upsetting the fragile balance of power in Gaul. Others suggest that Aetius, bound by old ties of respect to the Huns, deliberately held back. Whatever the truth, the decision meant that Attila lived to fight another day. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains was one of the bloodiest of antiquity. Estimates of the dead range from tens of thousands to over 100,000, though the numbers are uncertain. What is clear is that it was a turning point. Attila had been checked. His aura of invincibility had been shaken. Yet he was not finished. For Attila, defeat was only a temporary obstacle. His eyes now turned to the very heart of the Western Empire, Italy itself. Thus ended one of the greatest battles of the ancient world. The Huns, though battered, withdrew with their spirit unbroken. Rome and her allies, though victorious, were left shaken by the sheer scale of the slaughter. The clash at the Catalaunian Plains was not just a military engagement, it was a moment when the fate of Europe hung in the balance. And Attila, the scourge of God, was not yet done with Rome. By the mid-450s, Attila had become not merely a warlord, but a figure that loomed over the entire Roman world. His armies had plundered Gaul, his riders had reached the very gates of Rome's most prosperous cities, and his reputation had grown into something larger than life. Both Eastern and Western Rome had paid him tribute, and yet neither empire could rest easy. Attila's very existence seemed to threaten the fragile balance of the late Roman world. In 452, after the climactic battles in Gaul, Attila turned his attention once again toward Italy. His reasoning was both strategic and psychological. The Roman heartlands remained largely untouched by his wrath, and he wished to demonstrate that no city, not even Rome itself, could remain outside his grasp. The march into Italy was brutal. The Huns swept across the Po Valley, burning villages, uprooting villages, and leaving devastation behind them. Aquileia, one of the wealthiest cities in the north, was reduced to ruins. According to some chroniclers, the destruction of Aquileia was so complete that people centuries later would point to its rubble and whisper that once a great city had stood there. Refugees fled by the thousands, some finding their way to the marshlands of the Adriatic coast, a region that would, in time, evolve into Venice. As the Huns advanced deeper into Italy, panic spread across the Western Empire. Emperor Valentinian III and his court were powerless. Rome's legions were depleted, its coffers nearly empty, and its morale shattered after years of defeats. With no army strong enough to repel Attila, the Romans turned to a different weapon: diplomacy. It was then that Pope Leo I, later called Leo the Great, stepped forward. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Leo believed that spiritual authority could sway even the fiercest of barbarians. He volunteered to meet Attila face to face, hoping to persuade the scourge of God to turn back. For many Romans, it seemed like an act of madness, sending a priest, no matter how eloquent, to confront the most feared man on earth. Yet, desperate times demanded desperate measures. The accounts of the meeting vary, but all agree on its extraordinary outcome. Somewhere along the banks of the Mincio River, near Mantua, Pope Leo rode out to meet the Hun king. Attila's camp was, as always, filled with the trappings of war: horse hides stretched into tents, weapons piled in heaps, and warriors sharpening their blades as they watched the holy man approach. Dressed in the simple yet dignified robes of his office, carried no weapons, and came with only a small retinue. Attila, intrigued by his courage, allowed the Pope into his presence. What followed has become one of the most famous diplomatic encounters in history. We do not have a verbatim record of their conversation, but later chroniclers claimed that Leo spoke with a calm authority that even Attila could not ignore. He reminded the Hun king that even the mightiest rulers were still subject to divine judgment, that earthly power was fleeting, and that Rome, though weakened, remained under the special protection of the Christian God. Some legends even claim that Attila saw a vision, perhaps of the apostles Peter and Paul, standing behind the Pope, brandishing swords and warning him against attacking the eternal city. Whatever the truth, the effect was undeniable. Attila agreed to turn back. The man who had burned cities to the ground and slaughtered armies now ordered his riders to halt and begin the long march out of Italy. Why? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some argue that Attila's army was already weakened. Famine had spread in northern Italy, disease plagued his men, and his supply lines were stretched thin. Others note that eastern Rome had begun to regroup and threaten his rear, forcing him to reconsider his campaign. Still, the symbolism of the meeting with Pope Leo cannot be dismissed. In the eyes of contemporaries, it was nothing less than divine intervention, the hand of God staying the wrath of the Huns. For Attila, however, this was not a retreat born of defeat, but of calculation. He had demonstrated his power once again, humbled Rome's rulers, and shown that even the eternal city trembled at the mention of his name. He returned to his stronghold beyond the Danube, richer in treasure and more infamous than ever. The meeting with Pope Leo became one of the defining moments of Attila's legend. To Christians, it showed that faith could triumph where armies had failed. To the Huns, it was another demonstration of their leader's cunning. He could bend to circumstances when it suited him, avoiding unnecessary risks while preserving his aura of invincibility. But as Attila rode back from Italy, perhaps even he sensed that his reign of terror could not last forever. He had tested the limits of his power and found them near, yet he remained restless. His ambitions, both political and personal, still burned fiercely, and within just a year, fate would intervene in a way no one expected. Not on the battlefield, but on the night of a wedding feast. The final chapter of Attila's life was not written on the battlefield, nor in the dust of a devastated Roman town, but in the intimacy of his own wedding chamber. The year was 453 AD, and Attila, by now in his late 40s, had reached the peak of his power. He had forced both Eastern and Western Rome into submission, exacted tribute that filled his treasuries, and commanded an empire that stretched across the vast plains of Europe. And yet, the man who terrified nations would meet his end in a way no one could have predicted. Attila had taken many wives throughout his life, as was the custom among the Huns. Marriage was often a matter of politics, a way to secure alliances and demonstrate prestige. But his final bride, a young woman named Ildiko, stood apart in the chronicles. She was of noble lineage, some suggest Germanic, others Gothic, but the details of her background remain obscure. What matters is that on that night, she became the last companion of the scourge of God. According to the historian Jordanes, Attila threw a grand wedding feast. The Huns, known for their austere lifestyle, were nevertheless capable of extravagant celebrations when the occasion demanded. Guests drank deeply, fires roared, songs were sung, and warriors toasted their king, believing he was about to begin a new chapter of life. Attila, despite his ruthless image, was said to be in high spirits, proud of his unmatched conquests, and convinced that his reign was far from over. None suspected that this might would mark not renewal, but an end. As the revelry died down, Attila retired with his bride. By dawn, he would be found lifeless. The chronicles record his death in language as it is haunting. One account claims that he drank too much, became flushed, and as he slept, a nosebleed overwhelmed him. Because he was lying on his back, the blood choked him silently, and he never awoke. Another version, whispered with dark fascination, claimed that Ildiko herself was involved, that she slit his throat or otherwise murdered him, perhaps under orders from Roman agents or as an act of personal vengeance. For centuries, historians have debated which version holds truth. The medical explanation, death by hemorrhage, may be plausible, especially if Attila suffered from a condition like high blood pressure or an aneurysm. But the timing on his wedding night and the presence of a young bride who would later be accused of treachery has always fueled suspicion. It's Baal's fear. To the enemies of the Huns, this death was not just convenient, it was poetic, the unstoppable warlord undone not by an army, but in the secrecy of his own bed. The reactions to his death tell their own story. When word spread through the Hunnic camp the next morning, disbelief gave way to shock and grief. From men who had seen their leader cut through the might of Rome and beyond, the thought that he had perished in such an unheroic manner seemed unthinkable. They expected Attila to fall in battle, sword in hand, with thousands weeping vengeance. Instead, the scourge of God had been silenced in the most ordinary, almost embarrassing way imaginable. The funeral of Attila was unlike any the world had seen. According to Jordanes, the Huns cut their faces and mingled their blood with tears, mourning their leader in the only way they knew, through pain. They placed him in a series of coffins, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron, symbolizing the wealth he had accumulated, the power he wielded, and the battles he fought. Treasures from his empire were buried with him, so that no one could ever profit from his death. The men who dug the grave were killed afterward to keep its location a secret. Even today, the resting place of Attila remains undiscovered, hidden somewhere in the vast plains of Eastern Europe. But the death of Attila was more than the loss of a man. It was the unraveling of an empire. His sons, though numerous, lacked the unity and ferocity of their father. Rivalries between them quickly fractured the Hunnic power base. Within a generation, the Hun Confederation would collapse, their dominions scattered to the winds, leaving only terror in memory. Rome, which had trembled at Attila's footsteps, would breathe again, for a while. Thus, the man who was called the Scourge of God met his fate not in war, but in marriage. his story became a legend, retold with awe and suspicion, wrapped in rumor and myth. Was he betrayed? Was his death a punishment from the divine, striking him down at the height of arrogance? Or was it simply the cruel randomness of nature, a fragile human body giving out in the quiet of the night? For the Romans, it was easy to see the hand of God. How else could such a monster be destroyed, except by divine intervention? For the Huns, it was tragedy and humiliation, an end that denied their king the glory of battle. For history, it remains one of the great mysteries, how a man who held the fate of empires in his grasp could be undone by something so small, so personal, and yet so final. Attila's wedding night was his last. His empire died with him, but his legend never did. The night of Attila's death was as mysterious as his life had been fearsome. In the year 453, after decades of conquest, the great king of the Huns met his end not by sword or spear, but in silence, within his wedding chamber. He had taken a new bride, Ildiko, a young woman of Germanic descent. The celebrations lasted long into the night. His warriors drank, sang, and glorified their leader, believing that nothing could stop him now. Yet when dawn came, Attila did not rise. The servants found him lying motionless, his face pale, his body still. Some said he had drowned in his own blood, struck down by a sudden nosebleed after heavy drinking. Others whispered that Ildiko herself had slain him, perhaps to avenge her people, perhaps forced by those who feared Attila's unending wars. Still others believed it was the hand of God, striking down the scourge of the earth at the very height of his pride. News of his death spread like wildfire. To his warriors, it was unthinkable. The man who had defied Rome, who had marched into Gaul and Italy, who had bent emperors to his will, gone overnight, without a battle, without glory. The Huns buried him in a manner befitting a figure of myth. According to legend, they placed him in 3 coffins, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron. The precious metals symbolized his wealth and his greatness. The iron symbolized the weapon with which he had ruled. His grave was hidden in secret, the laborers who dug it executed, so no one could ever find it. With Attila's passing, the empire of the Huns began to crumble. His sons fought among themselves, dividing the once mighty horde into fragments. The subject tribes, Gepids, Ostrogoths, and others, rose in rebellion. Within a few short years, the unstoppable wave that had threatened to drown Europe simply broke apart, leaving scattered remnants where once there had been terror. And yet, Attila's name did not vanish. For centuries, people remembered him as a force of nature. To some, he was a monster, a destroyer, an embodiment of divine wrath sent to punish the Romans for their sins. To others, he was a brilliant leader, a warrior who carved out an empire against impossible odds. In Germanic legend, he became Attila, the cruel king of the epics. In Norse sagas, his figure loomed large, a reminder of the age when barbarians and Romans clashed for the soul of Europe. Even today, historians debate the man behind the myth. Was he truly the savage destroyer the Romans described, or a cunning ruler who sought order among warring tribes? His empire vanished, but his legacy endures in every tale, every legend, every whispered fear of the past. Attila's life closed with as much mystery as it had fury. He was not slain in battle, nor captured by his enemies. Instead, the man who shook empires fell in the quiet of the night, leaving behind questions that history will never fully answer. And so the story of Attila the Hun ends. Sudden, strange, and unforgettable. The scourge of God, who had brought Rome to its knees, was undone not by an army, but by fate.